Hi, this is Scott. Welcome to GreatScott Knitting Dyes Yarn, Episode 2. Today's episode is a recap of my most recent yarn dyeing experiments using food coloring. Yarn dyeing is very new for me. I've done some reading about dyeing fiber and watched a lot of yarn dyeing videos on YouTube. I am no expert, but I will try and share with you some of my experiences on this journey. When dyeing yarn with food coloring, there are a few things required to be successful. You will need to be working with protein-based fibers. Typically, this would be fiber from animals, such as wool from sheep, mohair from goats, alpaca fiber, or silk from silkworms. Then you need the dye in the form of food color. In the United States, food coloring is governed by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or FD&C. The only food colors allowed for food in the United States are Blue 1 for blue, Blue 2 for indigo, Green 3 for turquoise, Red 3 for pink, Red 40 for red, Yellow 5 for yellow, and Yellow 6 for orange. Next, you need some form of acid like white vinegar or powdered citric acid. The acid helps the protein fiber attract and bind the dye. Without it, the dye would just wash out of the fiber. Then you need to heat the fiber and acid for a period of time to set the dye in the fiber. You can use pots and pans on the stove or in the oven, a microwave, a crock pot, or even the sun. In today's experiments, I will be using a couple skeins of Knit Picks Stroll fingering weight yarn. The Stroll base is a 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon yarn. I am preparing the yarn by soaking the skeins in some room temperature water that has about 1 tablespoon of white vinegar mixed in it. I will allow this to soak for at least 20 to 30 minutes for good fiber saturation. For the first skein, I'm going to try an immersion dyeing technique called dip dyeing. The color I'm going to work with is a blue-green teal color that I am creating by mixing drops of blue food color with drops of green food color. So to my dye pot, I have about 8 cups of water, which I have brought to a simmer. And to that, I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of white vinegar to provide that acid that we need for the binding of the dye to the fiber. Next, I'm going to add the dye mixture that I had created prior to the dye bath. Now, one thing that I noticed when I did this is that food coloring is not as deep as a color as it looked in the measuring cup. It looks really pale. So I'm going to increase the number of drops. Now I had started off with 8 drops of blue food coloring and 4 drops of green food coloring. And so I just added 4 more blue and 2 more green to see where that takes us in terms of the level of dye. And where it is darker than what I started with, it's not quite what I'm looking for. So I'm going to add 4 more drops of blue and 2 more drops of green to the dye bath to see if that brings us closer to what my thoughts are for this dyeing experiment. It looks a little closer to what I want to go with, so I'm going to work with this it's clear that food coloring requires a lot more drops than I imagined to get the darker or more substantial colors that are in my head. So now I'm going to get my skein of yarn that I have pulled from the soaking bin and squeezed most of the, well, a lot of the water out of it. And I'm going to begin dipping it into the dye bath and moving it around a little bit to get some, general penetration and cover in everything. And the idea of this is that it'll be darker on the end that I'm dipping in, and that will start pulling color out of the water. And you can see it's moving from a green to more of a blue. And then I'm going to go ahead and put the end of that into that blue. So it'll go from a greenish color to a bluish color. And that's really the effect that I was attempting to go for. So I'm just going to gently move the fiber around a little bit in that remaining color. And then I'll let it sit and probably come back in about 10 to 15 minutes to see where the dye bath is. It's been about 15 minutes, so let's see where we're at. Oh, my zip tie has come undone. You can see that the water of the dye bath has cleared of the food coloring. I'll just go ahead and reattach my zip tie. Those really make it a lot easier to handle the yarn and to keep it from getting tangled. The yarn is a lot greener as I look at it closely than what I was expecting. And there are some really, really light areas to the skein. What I think I'm going to do is add a whole lot of blue food coloring to the dye pot and mix that in and see if I can over dye what I already have and get a more blue shade. So I added about 20 or 25 drops of blue food coloring to the pot. And now I'm going to go ahead and add the skein of yarn back in. I'm going to gently move the skein around a little bit so that the dye has access to as much of the fiber as possible. And then I'll let it sit and simmer for about 10 minutes. With the 10 minutes up, I'm just going to check to see how much dye is left in the pot, and you can see that there is a little bit. I think that there's enough heat going on here that I can just cover it and let that remaining dye soak into the fibers as the skein cools off. The dye pot has fully cooled, and so I'm just going to check to see if all the dye has been absorbed, and it has. So now I can go ahead and pull this skein out, which looks a lot closer to what I was imagining. I'll then rinse the skein in some room temperature water and maybe a little bit of soap, hang it to dry, and then we can check it out at the end. For the second skein of yarn, I am doing what is called a low immersion dyeing. Instead of fully putting the yarn in a underwater. This simply is in a pan with about an inch of water to really not even cover the yarn. I did this late at night, so I didn't even set up my camera to record video. So all I have is this picture of what I've been working on. What I did was I placed the pan on my stove across a couple of burners and had those burners on low to provide the heat we would need. The water also had a tablespoon of vinegar in it to give us the acid. I then took my food coloring bottles. I used yellow, green, and blue. And I dropped the food color randomly directly onto the yarn from the food coloring bottle. I then used a spoon to spread the and work the dye into the lower parts of the yarn so that it had more penetration. I then flipped the yarn over, redistributed the yarn in the pan, and did the same thing again. The second side didn't require as many drops because I tried to put the blue drops back in the blue sections, yellow and yellow sections, and so on. So it would maintain sort of the same bleed pattern that I had established on the front side. I think the effect is really pretty because you have some points of intense color matched with lighter colors, and then the mixing and blending of the colors with each other. Once this skein has fully cooled off from being heated, I will then rinse it in some cool water with a little bit of dish soap to wash out any acid as well as any dye that has not actually taken up into the yarn. I'll then hang it up and let it dry, and we can take a look at the finished product. Here are our finished products. The first skein on the left, you can see has some darker areas of teal, but also with it changes into lighter blues with some patches of darker blue with it. A really lovely, solid, tonal skein of yarn, and I actually like how it turned out. The skein on the right-hand side, really, I'm very excited about this skein. I really love how it turned out with the deeper blues, the greens, the teals, the yellow patches. I think it makes for a really lovely, variegated skein of yarn that I'm excited to work with. So here are the results of this experiment. I really like how these two skeins of yarn complement each other in their tones and coloration. I'm excited about using them, and I'm also excited to continue trying some of these methods of dyeing yarn, both the dip dyeing and the low immersion dyeing directly onto yarn with food coloring. So this has been a recap of my latest dyeing experiment here at GreatScott Knitting. Thank you for watching. If you like what you see, click like, and if you want to see more, click subscribe. Have a great day.